Today on Ag News Daily.
We had the fastest rate hiking cycle that we've ever had in probably 20, 30, 40 years with this most recent increase in rates. And we did see the Fed cut rates by 50 basis points. Then they cut rates again by 25 basis points. What happens moving forward? I think there's a little bit more uncertainty.
Well, welcome back to the weekly edition of the Ag News Daily Show. This is Tanner, and that's Delaney. If you're the first time joining us, we appreciate you coming to hang out. Oh, really? You put this in the teleprompter?
I didn't write the script.
Well, you liar. Yes, Iowa State had a tough Saturday, but they beat the Hawkeyes last night in basketball. So go third-ranked Iowa State basketball. That game was about as cold as the weather is right now. We had a frigid start to December for much of the U.S. There's some lake effect snow near the Great Lakes. AccuWeather's long-range experts have forecasted a temperature tug of war in an updated winter forecast. Long-range forecaster Paul Pastlock says that you should get ready for lots of ups and downs this winter with temperature swings. He says you're going to see waves of colder air throughout the winter season with brief warm-ups. December kicked off with an Arctic blast in the eastern U.S., leaving much of the west in mild and dry conditions. This pattern is flipping, though, in mid-December with a thaw in the mild weather east of the area, and the central U.S. now is seeing some rain and snow. Looking ahead in the Midwest, a couple of systems next week may bring a mix of rain and snow that could help with the ongoing drought situation that we report. Delaney?
Well, we're going to see some cold and winter weather here in central Iowa as well. But switching topics here, testing requirements to the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service announced the start of a national milk testing strategy to address H5N1 infections in U.S. dairy herds. This measure builds on steps already taken by the USDA and its federal and state partners since H5N1 was first found in cattle back in March. The federal order and guidance requirements that unpasteurized milk samples nationwide will be sent to the USDA for testing. This guidance was developed with significant input from state, veterinary, and public health officials and will provide comprehensive surveillance to our nation's milk herds. The new federal order requires raw milk samples upon request from any entity responsible for a dairy farm, such as milk transporters, transfer stations, or processing facilities. And it also requires owners with positive cattle to provide information to help with tracing. Lastly, it allows veterinarians to report their tests to USDA labs. Raw or unpasteurized milk from dairy herds and processors nationwide must be tested on request starting December 16th. As we think about how avian influenza may impact the swine industry, I caught up recently with Dr. Megan Niederwerder as we talked about her role at the SCHIC Swine Health Information Center and, more importantly, the impact they're watching to see how H5N1 may impact the swine industry after having a case reported. So let's turn it over to that quick conversation. Well, I'm excited to catch back up with Dr. Megan Niederwerder from SCHIC Swine Health Information Center. We chatted, Megan, at the World Pork Expo, which feels like a long time ago now. But when we were talking at World Pork Expo, we were talking about maybe the hypotheticals of what would happen should avian influenza HPAI make the leap into pork. And we've now seen that happen. So I wanted to bring you back onto the podcast to talk a little bit about how that unfolded, and then maybe kind of the what-if scenarios to come along with that. But thanks for joining.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yes, on October 30th, there was the first detection in a U.S. pig of H5N1, and there's a couple of characteristics of that detection that are really important. One is that it was a non-commercial farm. It was a backyard operation, and the pig was never intended for the food supply. And so pork maintains and continues to be safe for consumers. The other aspect of that detection is that it was in a single pig, and there were 5 pigs on site. None of them showed any clinical signs of H5N1, and they were co-housed with poultry, sheep, and goats. And so the impetus of the investigation was that the poultry were showing clinical signs, high mortality rates, and then H5N1 was detected in those birds. Because the swine had connection or had access to the birds, they were also tested and then investigated because it was the first detection in a pig, but certainly some characteristics that are substantially different than our commercial operations with regards to access to birds. But we still want to learn from this and make sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent entry into the commercial swine population.
Well, from your perspective, then, what are maybe some of those things we've learned to, make sure it doesn't happen in a large commercial operation?
Yes, I think there's a few things that we can take from this. Certainly, one of them is that we have to expand our biosecurity considerations from swine farm to swine farm, which has been historical consideration. Now we have to think about, are there operational connections from swine farm to poultry operation or from swine farm to dairy farm? We want to make sure that we are asking our animal caretakers, do you have any connections with a dairy cattle or with a poultry farm? And then are you working on a swine farm? Are there connections there? Is there any contract crews that may be going back and forth between these different livestock operations? The other thing is equipment and supplies. We have to sort of broaden our scope of how we think about these operational connections across different livestock industries.
Megan, as we think about some of the other exciting things that SHIC has going on this week at the National Association of Farm Broadcasters Annual Convention, you guys just released an announcement about a great new grant and research program that you're digging into. Give us a little bit of an overview of that program.
Yes, this has been a great collaborative effort. And so the Swine Health Information Center partnered with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Pork Checkoff to leverage checkoff funds. We have a $4 million research program, very large research program, looking at what are the risks of introduction of H5N1 into the U.S. commercial operation, but also how do we prepare and how do we mitigate those risks? How do we control the virus should it be introduced? So we have 10 research priorities that we're looking at. Some of them are, what are the clinical presentation in pigs should they become infected at different production phases? What are the vaccine potentials? Is there any cross protection in some of the influenza vaccines we already have available for other influenza, so H1 and H3? Is there an opportunity to look at diagnostics where we can have the earliest detection and confirm eradication, again, if the virus is introduced? And how do we think about those risks for our swine producers? Is there opportunity for deterring wildlife or wild birds around swine farms to reduce the risk of introduction? And so quite a large research undertaking, but very exciting because we certainly want to learn from this, get ahead of it, and provide those tools to our producers.
Yeah, very robust amount of research you guys are going to be conducted. What does the timeline look on that? And is there an added sense of urgency because we have seen it now in a non-commercial setting?
Yes, absolutely. We want to be responsive. We want to adapt our industry priorities based on what's going on in the industry. So that's really one of the big mission points for the Swine Health Information Center is to adjust to industry priorities as they arise throughout the year. Certainly, this has enhanced the urgency for which this information needs to be generated. So we released the RFP, which is the request for proposals, the beginning of November. The proposals are due by December 31st, and then we will start reviewing those, prioritizing those based on value back to pork producers, and then contract those early in 2025.
Any hypotheses on maybe things you think will come out of some of that research?
I think one of the big questions is what's the risk assessment for all these different avenues that we could consider as risk factors for introduction? Because we all have to prioritize resources towards that greatest risk. And so when we talk about cost-effective biosecurity protocols, certainly there's a lot that we could be doing, but we want to direct those resources towards the highest risk and the most cost-effective technologies and tools. And so that's going to be a big output of this research program is really where do we direct our resources to have the greatest impact for reducing risk of H5N1 to the commercial pig operations.
Okay, so we're talking reducing risk specifically for H5N1, not necessarily reducing risk of PRRS versus H5N1.
So sometimes these biosecurity practices are an umbrella of broad-scaping protection. So when you think about wearing site-specific coveralls and site-specific boots, certainly that could be for any virus. But when we talk about reducing animal caretaker crossover from swine farms to dairy farms at night, that at this point has a high priority towards H5N1 because we know that the dairy industry is continuing to have outbreaks. when we think about eliminating bird nesting and roosting sites near air inlets on swine farms, that could be any poultry disease or avian disease, but in this case, we're really looking at H5N1. So because these biosecurity practices may provide broader protection, certainly we could think about other diseases of concern.
As you think then about that impact back to the producer level you mentioned, you really want to do things that are going to move the needle most for pork producers and those working in the supply chain. Once you go through this research, how are you going to disseminate that information for producers?
Yeah, as you were talking, one of the research priorities is how do we maintain business continuity and what are the safest movements of pigs that can occur if the herd has been exposed. So certainly that's always top of mind. How do we continue to supply a safe pork to consumers, and how do we continue to have pork producers have business continuity? And so when we have these research projects and have the output, we will post those as they become available on swinehealth.org, our website. And of course, try and get the word out as quickly and as broadly as possible so that pork producers can start implementing those on farm.
And I'm curious to know, Megan, I'm sure you'd get out and get into the industry or having conversations with pork producers. What's the biggest question from them that you've been receiving about H5N1?
I think risk. Is it because it was a backyard operation? It's very different than commercial swine herds. And we know that the animals were mixed, which again is very different than the way that pork is produced in the U.S. What's the true risk of high biosecurity operations where pigs are maintained with high biosecurity protocols? We want to know what the risk is there because it's so different from this detection in a backyard herd, and so really that's the big question.
Megan, is there anything else we should touch on as we wrap up our conversation today?
I think if anyone's interested in some of the information that we have, not only on the research program, but also some of the influenza surveillance or risks to swine, what we've done so far is everything is on our website.
Great. Megan, thanks for catching up. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, great talk there. According to new data from the Association of Equipment Manufacturers in the U.S., sales of ag tractors and combines fell in November of 2024 compared to the year before. U.S. sales of tractors in all classes dropped 14.5% compared to November of 2023. U.S. sales of combines remained soft, showing a 24% decline year over year. AEM Senior Vice President Kurt Blades says that November sales of ag tractors and combines follow the same pattern as the last few months' softness in the market. He also says the slowdown in sales can be tracked back to high interest rates and uncertainty in the overall ag economy. So I'm interested to see what December looks like, Delaney.
Well, the Illinois Farm Bureau made fresh waves this week after announcing on Wednesday night that the American Farm Bureau Federation has rescinded its initial threat to terminate their membership on December 20th. Instead, the AFBF Board of Directors approved an amended resolution to end IFBF's membership 30 days after the conclusion of ongoing litigation between the two organizations. This decision comes shortly after IFB's contentious annual meeting, where accountability issues were a focal point as reported by several sources. The conflict stems from Country Financial, an affiliate of IFB, deciding to no longer require Illinois-based clients to purchase non-farm insurance policies to hold IFB memberships starting this past January. AFB is seeking to expel IFB from memberships in response to this policy change. In response, IFB filed a motion for preliminary injunction on November 21st, seeking to ensure that their county farm bureaus can continue using the Farm Bureau name.
Is that one of those "you can't fire me, I quit" situations?
I don't know.
Well, we had caught up with John Newton of Terrain discussing ag policy, interest rates, and what the upcoming weeks may bring to the farm and ag communities. We'll get into that interview from our conversation in November right after this message.
Calving season is a favorite time of year, but along with that special time are dangers, extra stress, and increased labor. Safety Zone calf catchers are all about safety and making processing new calves easier. Designed for ATVs or UTVs, one person can do the job and never be threatened by the protective mother cow. Make this and every calving season safer and easier with a Safety Zone calf catcher. Watch videos and customer testimonials or order yours today at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914. Affordable and made in the USA. Make your upcoming and all future calving seasons safer, easier, and stress-free. Durable and designed to work anywhere you can drive your ATV or UTV. Order online at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914 today.
Well, we have a familiar face in a new role. A lot of our listeners, I'm sure, John, have followed your work when you were at American Farm Bureau Federation. Excited to have you on the podcast today, chatting with John Newton, the executive head of Terrain. John, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be back.
John, I have to admit, as we were talking a little bit before we started recording today, Terrain was not on my radar until you made the move over to the organization. So I'd love to start there. I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with your work and your economic insight, but Terrain, they may not be. So let's do a 10,000-foot overview of who Terrain is and how you kind of interface within the space.
Absolutely. Well, when you think of Terrain, you need to think of farm credit. Terrain's an exclusive offering of our farm credit partners, American Ag Credit, Farm Credit Services of America, Frontier Farm Credit. So we work with those farm credit banks, those customers, those farmer owners. We are we do all the economic analysis. We're helping these farmers make more informed business decisions at Terrain.
Perfect. That's a great way to put it, and I think aligns really well probably with your focus over the last few years. This is just kind of a personal question I've always wanted to ask you. You know, you write about a lot of different topics with policy, trade, etc. What's your favorite one to dig into?
Wow, that's no one's ever asked me what my favorite one to dig into. I'll tell you what, I'm a recovering dairy economist, so I cut my teeth working on dairy. There's an old saying that only 4 people in the country know how milk is priced, and we can't all ride on the same airplane. I'm one of those people. But I've worked on ag policy issues, risk management, crop insurance for decades, nearly 2 decades. I'm passionate about that because it's important for family farms out there making business decisions, wanting to pass the farm on to the next generation. Marketing and risk management is key to that.
I didn't realize you'd gotten your start in dairy, so that's interesting to know, and I agree. Not an industry or an area I feel super comfortable with, so interesting to note. But John, as we look at where we're at here today, of course, the big question, the big sentiment floating around is what's going to happen in 2025, January 1st, when we see the new administration step into office. What are the factors that you're watching right now as we see that transition?
Well, you know, January is not that far away, but right now I'm very focused on the next 4.5 weeks because there are a number of issues that are real important to agriculture in rural America that Congress still has to address. We don't have a farm bill right now. The farm bill extension expired at the end of September, so we need to see, you know, is Congress going to do another extension of the farm bill, or are they going to come to the table and get a full 5-year reauthorization of a farm bill, a new contract with agriculture in rural America? That's important because the outlook going into 2025, if you're raising crops and in specialty crops even, the outlook next year is not better. Input costs still remain elevated. Prices are coming down. We need to see the farm bill done now, and that's before January. Once you get into next year, you start talking about tax policy. Who's the next Secretary of Ag? Who are the undersecretaries at USDA? Who are going to be who's going to be in the room providing the counsel to our next Secretary of Agriculture, who will be in the Oval Office sharing the stories of farm families around the country and why these policy issues are important in agriculture.
Well, and so I think, 70% of the voter base that voted for President Trump, I think something like that, large number, right, that is coming from rural America. So it's hopeful, I think, that he continues to acknowledge rural constituents. But I know this was something that you unpacked a little bit earlier this week. Give us kind of your overview on that rural voter base, how that's going to impact or guide the new incoming policy.
I don't think it was just the rural voter base. I think if you look over the last 4 years, for a lot of Americans, a lot of young people out there, this was the highest level of inflation that they had ever seen, historic inflation across the economy, and inflation's cumulative. So in order to deal with higher prices, you're dipping into your savings. You're eroding whatever capital, whatever assets that you have as a family. You look at people are concerned about crime. They were concerned about immigration. They were concerned about the economic future of this country, and I think that is what drove the turnout. And it wasn't just rural America. Families around the country have combated historic inflation, and they're looking for things to change.
As you think about, all of these big macro level things, I'm curious how that stuff boils down, the research, the analytics, the insight that you guys have. How does that boil down into the tools that you provide at Terrain?
Well, it all comes together to help farmers, working with their farm credit lenders, make more informed business decisions. We saw the inflation report came out yesterday, a little hotter than expected, quite frankly. We saw the jobs report that came in very, very low. That's going to impact what the Federal Reserve does on interest rates. Are we going to see another cut? What the Federal Reserve does on interest rates impacts the operating loan that a farmer's going to have next spring. So the macro events come all the way back down to the farm. The political events come all the way back down to the farm. And our analysts, we've got a great group of analysts, they're tracking it in the grain space, in the livestock protein space, in the specialty crop space, and even in the wine space. So our analysts are tracking all of these macro and micro issues and policy issues to be in the room with our farm credit customers, helping them make good business decisions.
I'm glad you mentioned interest rates. I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal glass ball a little bit for us. We saw an interest rate cut for the first time in 2 years, 3 years. I can't remember now how long it's been. It's been a while. What do we see from here? Do we see another interest rate cut? Has it worked as the Federal Reserve had intended it to, with raising interest rates and then cutting them?
Well, I can tell you we had the fastest rate hiking cycle that we've ever had in probably 20, 30, 40 years with this most recent increase in rates. And we did see the Fed cut rates by 50 basis points. Then they cut rates again by 25 basis points. What happens moving forward? I think there's a little bit more uncertainty. The jobs report was more of an anomaly that we saw. I don't think the jobs report is that bad as what we saw most recently. The inflation was a little hotter than expected. I think the Fed wants to be careful not to fuel inflationary pressure moving forward. And then, the elephant in the room is we're going to transition into a new administration. I know the Federal Reserve doesn't, Chairman Powell doesn't report to the president, but obviously the economic future of this country is dependent upon some of the decisions that the Fed makes, and we'll see how all that unfolds as we get into 2025.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that too. Unpack that a little bit more for our listeners. As you mentioned, the president doesn't have direct power over the Federal Reserve, but he does have an impact. How does that work?
Well, I think through his influence alone, and he is looking at everything that's impacting this economy, this country, and the cost of borrowing is one of those, major factors. And Congress is looking at it too. And I'll share a story. With the interest rates where they are, we are now spending more to service our debt than we are in national defense. That's a pretty chilling statistic, right? So the interest rate environment is very, very important. I'm sure it's something that the president, and when he assembles a team of economic advisors, they're going to be looking at that.
Borrower debt, now you're a little more closely tied to farm credit. Where are we at in that debt coverage ratio? It seems like operating notes continue to increase. Obviously, interest rates have come back down from their record highs. Do we see that translate out into operating notes for 2025?
Well, I think working with your farm credit lender to get your loans secured for 2025 is critically important. But I'll unpack it and I'll back it up a little bit. During the last downturn in the farm economy, Farm Credit was there for their agricultural customers. They increased their lending in operational loans. They increased their lending in real estate loans. They were there for farmers during the downturn. We are in another downturn in the farm economy, and your Farm Credit lenders, your partners, will help you navigate that, and Terrain's a key element of that too.
I'm going to ask you to speculate again. Your favorite thing to do, I know. Obviously, 24 has been a down year. We know 25 will be. What does 26 and beyond look like, and how long do you think this down cycle will last?
I think it's hard to tell. No one knows, what's going to happen. What I can say is, look, Mexico's our number one customer, our export market. Canada's number two. China's number 3. The president has said he wants to come in and relook at USMCA. He put the gold stamp on NAFTA, and it was USMCA. It's up for review. He wants to get back to the table with China and figure out how we move forward. China bought over $30 billion worth of agricultural products 3 years in a row, and that supported a healthy farm economy across this country. So there are always opportunities. Farmers will have an opportunity to evaluate the markets this spring, to make decisions on their farm, again, working with their farm credit lender. But speculating out into 2026, I hope that things turn around in 2025, because with prices where they are, with margins where they are, it's a challenging economic environment in rural America.
Certainly is. John, is there anything we didn't touch on that you're also focused on in the year ahead?
Well, one of the things that we talked about earlier, my passion for policy, I am interested to see where we land on this next farm bill, the changes that are made. There's an opportunity to make a historic investment in agriculture in rural America in this next farm bill, and I'm talking beyond just risk management programs. We've got an ag trade deficit of negative $42.5 billion. We've never seen anything like that in agriculture. We need to invest in market access and foreign market development so we can go out and find and develop those new markets, diversify our customer base. We need to make investments in ag research. We are getting lapped by other countries around the world on ag research. We need investments in rural child care, rural health care. The communities that farmers and ranchers call home, we need to be there for them. So that's what I'm going to be paying attention to.
Great, John. Well, thank you so much for joining. Appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Well, Tanner, we've had an action-packed episode, and we're not quite done yet. As the lame duck Congress nears its holiday break, it appears unlikely they will address the Farm Bill before Christmas. Chris Hamp, the president of the National Grange, says many Americans don't realize how the lack of the Farm Bill hurts everyone. Hamp highlighted that the Farm Bill's critical role in supporting the nation's economy, public health, and food security will delay and cause significant setbacks not only for farmers but also rural communities. Jason Munanki, Wisconsin Farm Bureau's Director of Government Relations, told Brownfield Ag News that if Congress fails to pass new legislation, the Farm Bill would revert back to permanent law. He warned of a dairy cliff, which could cost taxpayers billions and drive consumer milk prices to more than $20 per gallon, potentially devastating the dairy industry. I know my husband will be disappointed by that news, as we are a big milk-drinking household.
Milk drinkers, that's right. Well, speaking of cattle, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association expressed gratitude to the Senate for passing the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act this week. In addition to providing much-needed relief to victims of hurricanes, this legislation provides tax reliefs for cattle producers who have received payments due to wildfires. Those payments were counted as taxable income, meaning producers who already suffered from disasters would hurt again by having their relief payments taxed. The act alleviates these issues by addressing limitations on casualty loss deductions, enabling producers to claim greater tax relief for disaster-related losses. Having already passed in the House, the bill now awaits the president's signature to become law.
Well, Tanner, to wrap up this week's show, we've got one more short conversation here, chatting with Tommy Grizzoffi to talk all things markets. Tommy Grizzoffi, welcome back to the show. It's excited to have you back. I think this is the first time we've had you since we've switched over to audio and video, so glad to see you and hear you today. You had some big announcements recently. You're the same great person, just sitting in a little bit different seat, an associated person now with Niederwerder Trading, and you do quite a bit of guest appearances on RFD TV, filling in for Scott the Cow Guy. So you're just moving and shaking right along, aren't you?
Yeah, and great to be here. Congratulations, you both. You've been both great mentors to me. Excited. Last weekend, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and I joined the group Niederwerder Trading. Great group of guys and gals, and I'm really enjoying my first week there. Change is never easy, but it was time.
Well, what doesn't change is what happens in the markets. So I know you've been busy, but I know you've kept an eye on things. What have you been seeing as far as it goes to commodities?
We had a nice little rally this week in corn, and farmers reward that rally as March corn hit 450. A lot of trade up there. As you know, we have these ladders at the CME group where you can see the bid and ask. Millions and tens of millions of bushels traded. Merry Christmas to the American farmer. I know you'd like to see corn with 5 in it, but 450 is halfway there. As far as soybeans, we're having good weather in Brazil. they're so great at growing them and they keep expanding. It's really tough. It's hard to compete with someone who's trying to literally bury you, and they are. So the American farmer has some pressure there when it comes to soybeans. What we've been talking to clients about is that corn bean rotation and what planning looks like for 2025. Also talking to clients about getting some bushels sold, turning into cash, and getting ready to pay down that operating.
Tommy, I think the other big question mark is just once we see President Trump step into office, does he go through with some tariffs? How does that impact the farmer's bottom line? Are you recommending any sort of specific risk management strategies ahead of that time, or is it just a wait and see game?
Great question. We do realize what's at stake here. I think people have this feeling that we may get deals done before the tariffs hit. When President Trump is referring to Canada's president as our 51st state, which is just hilarious. No insult to our Canadian friends and listeners. This is a different President Trump. I'm confident things will be okay in ag.
Well, that's a big comment to make. And I know a lot of our audience is anxious and excited. I think I saw a survey the other day, Delaney, that said machinery sales have climbed after the victory from Trump, that farmer what am I trying to say?
Farmer spending?
Yeah, farmer confidence.
Yeah.
Farmer confidence is up. So it's great to hear that. But I want to know, Tommy, what your thoughts are on what farmer confidence looks like.
Well, in particular, a lot of clients I work with in North Dakota or all over America, if the bushels show up, your confidence is high. It's no different than having a bunch of money in your checking account. You get this effect of it's going to be okay. We know numbers are tough for next year, but when the bushels are there, things are good. Now, if you're a farmer in southern Minnesota, and I have clients there also, they're a little bit more, just a little uneasy. They didn't have the bushels and the price isn't there. I'm in the bushel business. Have you ever heard me say that before?
I'm not sure. Maybe.
Bushels are good, and farmers' confidence is directly tied to the bushel. If you're in the cattle, it's tied to the weather and how your cattle are performing. The genetics are performing well when it comes to bushels here in America.
Tommy, the other thing I wanted to pick your brain about before we wrap up is interest rates, inflation. You know, sitting at Commodity Classic just under a year ago, that was a big focus for you the past 2 years. We've seen the Federal Reserve cut interest rates. We've seen, like Tanner indicated, a shift in consumer spending. Is the issue resolved from your perspective?
It's under control, but we still have inflation. Recently this week, we had a PPI number. The experts said that was hot. I've recently gotten quotes on health insurance, and that's going up, even though I'm an incredibly healthy guy. Health insurance, auto insurance, home insurance, up, up, up. That's a tax on the American people. And it really makes me angry, but what are you going to do? Not have insurance? So there's some things, interest rates have come down 0.25%, but my insurance bills have went up tremendously. Inflation is still brewing. Remember, inflation's like a fire. You think it's out, but if you still see smoke in those embers, it can come roaring back.
Well, one last question for you, Tommy. I know we don't get to have these talks as often as we used to on Ag News Daily. What are some key things to be looking out for that our listeners should pay attention to as this new year flips over?
Yeah, that's a great point. Getting banker ready. We're December. Merry Christmas, everyone. Pretty cool. We could say that again. No one's going to yell at us. But Merry Christmas. Get banker ready. Get your ducks in order. The treadmill's at a 5% incline when it comes to ag, being that we're going into a year that's going to have relatively high expenses and the price of the commodities tight. We could have a cash burn next year. Get ready for it. Don't be freaked out. We're telling you it's going to happen unless we get some great weather event that makes prices go higher, which would probably mean our yield would be lower unless the weather event happened somewhere else. Get ready to sell rallies, turn that grain into cash, pay down debt, get banker ready.
Perfect, Tommy. Well, appreciate your time and good luck in the new role. Well, it's great to have Tommy on the show, seeing his face. Definitely going to take him up on the offer to go to Nashville sometime.
I'd love to record Ag News Daily in Nashville. And Delaney was giving me a hard time about my attire today.
It's not very Christmassy.
This is a Travis Burkhart Foundation sweatshirt. So for all of you, if you're looking for end-of-year donations and giveaways, this is a fantastic foundation that picks up where insurance leaves off for those that are having financial troubles as far as medical stories and cases go about.
All right. Good message. I approve.
it was a gift last night, so it's fresh in the minds of our audience and mine. So appreciate all of you for hanging out with us this December and for all of 2024. Remember to interact on social media. We love connecting with you. And if you've got a guest that we should talk to, make sure you send that over. But for today, Delaney, what do you say? Should we let the listeners go?
Let's let him go.